Peter, it's a pretty scary title, but these are scary times. To outline for us, if you will, how this world war, and of course some people are saying that we're already in the foothills of it, how this world war might transpire.
Okay, so I think, firstly, that phrase used by the head of MI6, we're neither at peace or war, is probably the best way of thinking about it at the moment. Peace would be a lot easier than this, and war would be a lot worse. So, if we were in a proper major European or global war, you're probably talking about London being struck periodically in the way that Kyiv is being struck, so conventional ballistic missiles. Probably the same true of Paris, probably the same true of lots of other places in Europe. Most likely place for it to start is actually probably the other side of the world in the Pacific. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan is, I still think, probably the most likely single cause of a major global conflict.
But why? But that would only
start here.
Sorry to interrupt you, Peter, but that would only be a major global war if the Americans intervened on behalf of Taiwan, wouldn't it?
Yes, firstly, it would only be it might escalate pretty quickly if the Japanese intervene separately to the Americans and drag the Americans in. There are a variety of ways in which a Taiwan conflict could escalate. It's not inevitable, you're right.
But would the Americans be dragged in? They might just say, guys, it's Asia, right? This is China's backyard. You're on your own.
Well, so they've deliberately kept what they call strategic ambiguity over this for the past 30, 40 years. What they do have is very sophisticated war plans to intervene immediately, including using undersea drones, missiles, long-range strike to get in the way of a Chinese invasion force. Biden said that he would definitely do that if the Chinese invaded. He was asked that about 3 or 4 times during his presidency, and Donald Trump has said he will never give a strong answer one way or the other. Nevertheless, it is still one of the reasons why the Chinese aren't invading Taiwan today is that they believe there is a possibility the Americans might intervene if they did so. If that happened, I think it is incredibly likely that Russia would simultaneously go onto the offensive to grab the bits of NATO territory it wants in Eastern Europe, because America will be divided. So, to quote a former Danish head of the Danish Navy, if the Americans and Chinese fight, we will fight each other. There are also a bunch of ways in which war could break out in Europe. Maybe a coalition of the willing force in Ukraine after a ceasefire gets attacked, or more likely Russia comes into one of the NATO member Baltic states or Finland to try and grab a bit of territory.
And how likely do you think that scenario is? Because that's the one I'm hearing all the time. Roman tanks into Lithuania or whatever.
Overall in the book, I put a 30% chance of global war in the next 10 years. I think it's probably about the same for Eastern Europe, and I still think, despite all of the other issues, the most likely single... if I was sitting in Estonia, the most likely single trigger would be that China's gone loud in Asia and the Russians come in. But it's not impossible the Russians could mount their own operation. And the Poles and the Germans have said publicly that they believe that Russia could mount a very limited operation into NATO territory to, say, grab a city like Narva, even while it's fighting in Ukraine.
Okay. General Dominique Trinquand, you've been listening very carefully and nodding occasionally to what Peter had to say. Do you think that these are realistic scenarios?
I always think that the worst is not in the future. Russia, the ability of Russia to fight against NATO or European is very limited. For 4 years, they had been fighting Ukraine without winning. And so they are increasing. I think that war is a necessity for Mr. Putin to maintain his power in Russia. He doesn't want peace. So that means that he wants a war, but he's not able to really fight a war against NATO or European. So he will continue in Ukraine, as they're doing. And on the hybrid, using hybrid tool, he will fight against Europe, but not with kinetic tools.
Peter, isn't that a fair point that if Russia has barely moved the front line in Donbass in 4 years of fighting, and in fact since the beginning of the war, it's had to roll back in the areas around Kharkiv and so on, and hasn't really recaptured that, how can they possibly take on Poland, let alone the Baltic republics?
So I think firstly they would really, really struggle with Poland. So I think that's a good point. The issue comes if fighting stops in Ukraine and the Russians decide that they would do better in the Baltic states than against a Ukraine that is heavily militarized and ready. So the danger comes if the soft bit of the front line, and I think you're right, it's incredibly unlikely that that's going to be Poland, because the Poles are really put a lot of effort into militarizing that front line. The issue becomes the Germans are also reinforcing Lithuania pretty aggressively. The Canadians are reinforcing Latvia. The risk is particularly around Estonia, which is where the British and the French are, battle groups, the smallest of the three NATO forward battle groups, and it's the greatest Russian threat. If Estonia looks like the easy bit of the front line, particularly if you get a far-right government in France, the French pull out of NATO's command structures, as they said they might do. If we make Estonia the easy bit, then that may be where they come, particularly if they've got the top cover of the Americans being distracted by China, either by a hot war or by something that's on the edge of war in Asia.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've not heard that scenario before, but it's logical in itself. What about you, General? Do you agree with what Peter just had to say? Is that a realistic scenario?
No, I think the Baltic States are parts of NATO. We have troops there. You clearly said that the French and the British, mainly British battle group with French troops inside, are in Estonia, meaning that if the Russians are attacking there, they are attacking French and British troops, which is a major change. I just remind you that we are nuclear power. We've got deterrence, and I believe in deterrence. And I think that Mr. Putin believes in deterrence. That's why he doesn't want to fight against British or French.
Right. But does he, Peter, go on.
Yeah, but a really important point here. The reason that Estonia felt safe this Christmas, more than that Anglo-French force, important though it is, and one of the reasons the Estonians don't worry about a tactical nuke going into their main military base is it's got British and French troops there, so it is important, I'm not underplaying that, is that there were also 14 American tanks in Estonia over Christmas. Now, it's a much smaller force, but it's a much higher deterrent value because the Americans know if they kill those Americans, they'll be fighting the Americans in Europe. And the big NATO war plan created by Supreme Allied Commander Europe and particularly US Army Europe, a general called Chris Donahue, involves using American forces, and that's where the deterrent value comes.
Okay.
If those American forces aren't there, then yes, I absolutely agree with the French that Britain and France and Germany can do stuff, but that deterrent value drops off very dramatically if the US decides not to follow through on those plans.
Final question, brief one to both of you. Let me start with you, General Trinquand. If the Baltic republics were to be, invaded or attacked by Russia in any shape or form, this should trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Do you think the Americans under Donald Trump will honor Article 5 if the Baltic republics are attacked? Yes or no?
No. And I think that's why the deterrence is coming. Yeah, I say that the deterrence is coming from the UK and the French and not from the US. And
is that enough deterrence to put the Russians off?
Yes, of course. And I'm talking about nuclear deterrence, clearly.
Okay, Peter, what's your response? Will the Americans come in to defend the Baltics, and is our deterrence enough?
The French and British are important, and the French tactical nuclear deterrent is particularly important there. We only have Trident missiles, big submarine missiles, take out a city. The French have those. They also have a smaller nuclear missile they can fire long range. That's really important. However, I think if the Americans were to pull, I actually think Donald Trump probably would fight for the Baltics. I'm much less convinced by J.D. Vance. And I do not currently think that the British and French are doing enough to deter a limited attack against Estonia with what they're doing now. I think if the Americans were definitely pulling back, we would need to step up, and we would need to step up quite quickly. Okay,
you've already said 30% chance of a world war in the next 10 years. General, what is your view? How many percentages do you give the possibility of a world war in the next 10 years? What a cheerful question, eh?
Less than that. I will say 20% just to show that I'm more optimistic.
But you're not convincing me. Peter?
Last point. I would say that the point of both of those numbers is it probably won't happen, and if we do the right things, we can stop it. The issue is if we don't do the right things, that number will go up. And once it starts getting north of 40, 50%, that's when you really, really need to start worrying.